So the other day on Twitter, there was a question about what is your most unpopular Nintendo 64 opinion. And while there were some pretty straightforward ones about how you're supposed to hold the controller and the best game and the worst game and how the system looked, one came to mind after this past week of getting ready for this video, and that is we didn't get the best Nintendo 64 system. No. China actually got the best Nintendo 64 system. That's right, the iQue, believe it or not, is technically on a hardware level better than the Nintendo 64 that all of us pretty much know and are familiar with. So today I wanted to take a look at the iQue system, play a few games on it, take it apart of course, look inside and talk about what is, while the strangest Nintendo 64 system released, technically one of the best. Now the iQue was introduced in 2003 and was specific to China. It was developed with Nintendo and a few other companies to be in certain guidelines that the Chinese government had put forth for them because game consoles weren't exactly allowed in China at the time. It's taken quite a while to get to where we are now with the PlayStation and the Xbox and the Switch all releasing in China at this time. Back then, that was not the case. So while the iQue is a severely limited Nintendo 64 system, it did also come out in 2003 and had some technical advantages over the Nintendo 64 that we know releasing in the mid-90s. In fact, this system was still technically supported up until 2018 when the servers were pulled down. That's right, I said servers, because this was a Nintendo 64 that also had the ability to connect online and retrieve games in that way. You could buy them online and then have them transfer to this system. There's a lot of really cool things about this. So first off, let's take a look at the box, of course. iQue right there, and we have Mario flying in, you know, Mario 64 and all of this. I managed to grab this one online boxed. I really wanted to see what it looked like, of course, overall, see how they were advertising it. They even have SoC. I can't read Chinese, but I assume that is referring to the system on a chip inside of here, which was really interesting to see because they managed to shrink down the entirety of the Nintendo 64. We opened one before where they had to have multiple chips and cool it with a fairly large heatsink at the time. They managed to fit it down into what is essentially the size of a Nintendo 64 controller for the most part. Now we have the high quality Nintendo seal down here, the big 3D that looks like a piece of clip art there. And then if we start looking around it, we do have some of the features shown off here, which does include USB. You can connect this to a computer and you can retrieve any of the games that you buy that way, which was just kind of neat to see that, right? And then if we flip over to the back here, we can see a lot of different advertising for different games. And that does include Animal Crossing or Animal Forest, of course, as it was released in Japan on the Nintendo 64. We ended up getting that as Animal Crossing on the GameCube, but still, there's Wave Race, of course, Super Mario 64, there's Zelda Ocarina of Time, there's Star Fox, of course, Yoshi's Story. There are a lot of games here, but this, to me, looks like all of the games that were released. There are only 14 of them, and we even had some canceled, like Majora's Mask, and I believe there was even going to be like its own Ocarina of Time that was going to be created, kind of like the Master Quest. So let's go ahead and open this guy up here. We have our system, which again, just looks like a controller, right? And then we have a very odd cable in order to hook this thing up. So it did have to run power and AV through the same port technically on the system, which is this guy here. And in order to do that, we had a power input and AV here. So it came with a brick, which would be this guy. I could not use this, but I do have a universal adapter that I plugged in to make it work. But this was a 5-volt 2000 milliamp pack, and you can actually use, some people have fashioned a cell phone adapter in order to power this thing by kind of cutting this port off. I managed to find an adapter on Amazon that worked fine. I think it was like $10 or $11 or something, but it plugged in and I was able to play this no problem. And if we open this guy up, check this out. This is the entire system here. It really is like the size of a controller. It's also not even that heavy. This is the entire system here, and it really doesn't feel any heavier. It might even be a little lighter or close to like an Xbox One controller, for example. and this has everything in it. In fact, it even has a cartridge, and this cartridge was used to go around to different kiosks that were local, and that way they could control kind of the distribution of the different games. You wouldn't have cartridges that you would buy like you would for the Nintendo 64. You would just download any of the games to this cartridge here, pop it in, and then it would show up on the main menu. In fact, this cartridge even came with a game. It was Dr. Mario 64. That ended up being the best-selling game on this thing because, of course, it came with it. It's kind of like how they counted Wii Sports for the Wii, for example, but it also came with a bunch of timed demos that would give you a couple of hours to play a game, but once that timed demo ran down, you couldn't play it anymore. So if you end up buying one of these used, there's a good chance that all the demos have been played beyond the limit and it'll just be whatever you have on this guy. Now, fortunately, this one actually has quite a few games that were just on here. So I was able to play a lot of things. We played Mario Kart, Ocarina of Time, Dr. Mario, Animal Forest. Yeah, this one came loaded pretty well. So thanks to the person I got this on eBay. On the front, you can see we have our start button, power, and that has a green and red light depending on if it is on for you. Then we have a D-pad here that is as bad as it looks. Absolutely, it is a terrible D-pad, really is. But then we have A and B, and then of course our C buttons here. On the top, we do have L, R, and then Z has been kind of moved to right underneath L, so there is no button on the bottom here to press. Might have been a strange place for it, but I guess they couldn't figure out a better spot. I wouldn't have minded if it was like down here, maybe underneath of one of these grips to be able to press it. Now, on the top here, I mentioned we have a port right there, which is where the AV and the power plug in, and then above that, we have a little spot where you can plug your USB cable in and then also plug it into your computer to load your games. I think overall the controller is set up pretty well. Like in the hand, it's good. Again, it kind of reminds me of like an Xbox controller, just with the Nintendo 64. The stick is better than the Nintendo 64 stick that we were used to as well. It's certainly tighter. It doesn't feel as loose as that one would, where it would get really like lazy at times when you're playing it. I mean, this is one that's pretty old, right? I mean, this is an old system, 17 years old now, and the stick still feels pretty solid. Now, taking it apart, it looks like it's all just Phillips head screws on the bottom. Because this is shaped like a controller, I have a feeling this is going to be a pretty easy system to get apart with very minimal steps to get down to the board. So there we go. With those screws out, we can pop this guy up here. It looks like we have our L and R right here. I can't tell if those are wired in completely. It looks like they might be, so I'll have to just unscrew them from this side. So here we are with the backing off. It looks like my battery, because it does have a real-time clock, it looks like the battery was maybe replaced by someone at some point because it's just kind of falling off. Looks like it's even taped. It wasn't able to keep its time, so that makes some sense why that is. Maybe I'll actually change this one out just by desoldering it, soldering a new one in. That's pretty straightforward. And this is the entire board right here. It is very small. In fact, the way that they made this work is they took the fairly large motherboard for the Nintendo 64 and all the chips that were on there and shrunk them down to a single chip. Yeah, that's right, it's under here and it has its own heat spreader. We can see it does have this large kind of thermal pad here so that it could take heat from this guy, this NEC chip that was developed for this board specifically, and it is an R, as far as I can tell, there's not a ton of documentation even for the iQue, go figure, it's not exactly a popular system out there, but it is still a very similar chip to what was on the Nintendo 64, as they of course wanted to keep compatibility for the most part, but it is a more capable chip. It eliminates some of the bottlenecks for the Nintendo 64 and even ups the clock of the CPU 50%. It's still an R4300i, but because of course technology continued to advance, they ended up coming up with this chip to solve the problem of, well, they wanted to put it in basically a controller shell. Now it also had NAND flash memory, so it can store a lot of things on board, and it had 16 megabytes of RAM compared to, of course, the 4 and then 8 if you had the expansion pack installed. So this overall has its own expansion pack just built in straight up. Now it would of course need some of that extra RAM to run the OS and all that, but this was a very capable Nintendo 64 in the small form factor. And while it's been theorized that this system probably could have played a lot of intensive games that Nintendo 64 struggled with better, say Perfect Dark, GoldenEye, we never really are gonna find out unless somebody has a breakthrough and is able to hack this system, because there were only ever 14 games, and a lot of those more intensive games did not come over. However, people have found that getting through and into games is quicker and all of that, but unfortunately, the games that you would use to really benchmark this just don't exist on it. You know what's really cool is if the stick did go bad, it was like one of the first things that would come out, so it was pretty easy to change as well. And like I said, this is a pretty solid stick for the most part. I don't think this can be used in a standard Nintendo 64 controller. It looks a bit large, but I do like kind of the setup they have here. It certainly feels much more reliable than the one we had in the US. And then removing the board, you can see we have another thermal pad on the opposite side, and it looks like what they would use kind of as a backing to pull more heat off. So they were trying to cool this from both sides essentially, and I would say they successfully did it, because the unit itself does not get super warm when you're using it, which is great, because the Nintendo 64 could have its own overheating problems at times if it wasn't making correct contact with the heat sinks that were inside of the system. And even when people make portable systems out of that Nintendo 64, they can run into overheating problems if they try to eliminate some of that heat sink a bit too much. I just think it's super impressive that they were able to take that entire Nintendo 64 and a controller and shrink it down to this size. It is very, very impressive. And looking at the little NEC chip here, I do notice that it has a heat spreader on it. And I don't know if anyone's ever looked underneath of this heat spreader, and we're this far, so maybe we could take a shot at it. Now, unfortunately, I haven't been able to find any images of this chip without the heat spreader, so I'm not 100% sure where components are on it, but it's for science, right? So we'll see what we get here. Let's try to cut into this chip. Thinking from this corner here, we can try to cut in and then slowly go around the edge and see if we can pop this up. So we can see we've slowly worked this underneath of this corner here. Generally, for a lot of these heat spreaders, there is like glue around the edges, and a lot of times you can cut underneath of that and this will pop off. So it was quite a job to get this heat spreader off for a few reasons. One, I didn't know if there were any small components underneath that I was trying to be careful to get around, and two, I didn't know how much glue was under here, but take a look at this. So here's our heat spreader, and you can see just how much glue was all the way around the edge, and then we can see the die in the middle there that would of course push heat off until the heat spreader, and then wherever it could after that. We saw some thermal pads pushing it to the front of the system and then to the back as well. But yes, not a lot here, no writing or anything on the top of this die. I started to kind of wipe off any of the very dry thermal compound on the top there. I guess we'll put it back together and test it and make sure everything's good, but I guess I'll drop some MX4 on there, give it a nice little upgrade for that. Overall, I was pretty impressed with the iQue system itself. It's very small, and for what it actually pulls in terms of power, it is comparable to something like the Super Nintendo Mini, even using a similar wall adapter with a USB cable if you wire it up correctly. The only issue here is while they were able to make a system on a chip for the Nintendo 64, effectively creating a Nintendo 64 Mini, all of the games had to be designed specifically for it, so that would take quite a bit of time if Nintendo ended up wanting to do something like this for a Nintendo 64 Mini in the future. Also, I was slightly concerned that I had damaged the chip when I cut the heat spreader off, but after I sealed it up to make sure it wouldn't short on the heat spreader above it and powered it on, it still worked. So I'm still good, at least with this iQue. I just need to replace that battery, and it uses some weird CR1220 soldered in battery, so I went ahead and placed an order, and that should be here in a week or so to finish this up. I think for this system releasing in 2003 and able to consolidate the entirety of the Nintendo 64 into what is effectively the size of an original Xbox controller is very impressive overall. And I like that they were able to take that 64 and kind of shrink it down into a system on a chip And I mean, that could be something that we're talking about in the future for a Nintendo 64 Mini. I don't think they'll go this route necessarily, because this was a chip that was created specifically for this system, more of an evolution of the Nintendo 64. It might go the same route as what the Super Nintendo Mini did, using an ARM chip, but it is nice to know that Nintendo has tackled something like this in the past, and who knows, maybe in the future they could do it again.